Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Canadian Electricity Association's Conversation webinar series. I'm Diana Dominique, Director of Customer Council here at CEA, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Today, we're having a panel discussion with Oracle on utilities post-COVID, what's next, and how utilities should respond. The CEA has worked with our corporate partners to develop this webinar series, which focuses on solutions to current and future challenges faced by our industry. We have members joining us from across the country, so thank you so much for your participation. Before we get started, feel free to type your questions into the chat function, and we will ask those questions at the end of the webinar. And the meeting organizer has muted you, and we'll also send out a brief survey to the members to ask for their input after the webinar. So let's get started, and I'll introduce our expert panelists. From Oracle, we have David DeMaio, who is the Senior Vice President with Oracle Utilities, and Mike Aguiar, Teaching Associate Professor of Economics at UNC Chapel Hill. Marissa Uchin is Vice President of Global Regulatory Affairs at Oracle Utilities, and Matt Frates is the Senior Manager of Analytics from Oracle Utilities. Our panelists will discuss current utility challenges and the macroeconomics driving them, including the pre-COVID economy, challenges that have accelerated or altered because of the pandemic, and the future of our economy. We'll also talk about how this is impacting utility regulation, customer preferences, and then finally, we'll talk about some practical utility case studies. So David, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this episode of the CEA's Conversation Series. As mentioned, today we brought together an esteemed group of experts, and we're going to be talking about the implications, impacts, and the responses to the pandemic. Michael's going to provide us some valuable insights into the economic trends that are and will continue to impact us and our customers every day. Marissa will bring forward the perspective of the regulator and how those charged with protecting both the public interest and the industry as a whole are responding. And Matt's going to bring forward observations regarding consumer and customer behavior that are directly relevant to how we engage with our customers in these really, truly unprecedented times. If we go to the next slide. And I'd also like to encourage use of the chat function. If you have any questions that come up as we're going through this or observations, please take the time to put those in the chat, and we'll make sure to respond to them as we move through and get to the end. You know, it's really interesting. We're now 10 months into a global pandemic. The future growth of nationalism on the world stage, social unrest in major markets around the world, Eastern Europe, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and closer to home in the United States. Many have pointed out that there's been nothing like this before. Others have taken the exact opposite perspective, that we indeed have seen this type of thing before. There are some trends that we cannot be ignored, and Michael's going to speak to some of those trends. But what's really interesting is how some of these trends can be predicted, including the impact to consumers and the resulting consumer behavior. Though somewhat unprecedented in our lifetimes, the challenges, concepts, and trends impacting consumer behavior have been in play for a while now. What I would argue is that these recent unprecedented times have in effect compressed the timeline in which we would have expected some of these changes to occur, and at times amplified the nature of those changes. So what does this mean? Utilities have been on a transformation journey over the past few years that has put the customer at the center of the business. This journey, if anything, has now been accelerated by recent times. But it's not just accelerated. Now we're actually dealing with reprioritization of those activities and a shift of focus that has impacted some aspects of our transformation journey. We're actively working to digitize both the grid and our interaction with our customers. And this is now increased in criticality as we're having to determine new ways in which our field crews operate and how we interact with our customers. We used to have room to plan, test, and deploy new strategies over months and years. Now we're revamping how we work in weeks, developing new processes and procedures, and deploying new tools and methods really in days. This has impacted not just how we physically interact with our customers, but also how we commercially interact with them. We have whole segments of customers that have never faced financial stress before, now having to take decisions between home, food, and electricity for the first time in their lives. They're not equipped well to deal with these stresses, nor is our business model structured to absorb the incremental financial stress of new segments of our consumers struggling to make ends meet and pay their bills. We're seeing all of this while other aspects or other segments of our customer base are seeing marked decrease in demand. The transformation journey that we've been on is still valid, but if anything, it's been accelerated. We need to continue to adjust quickly. One aspect of our transformation, I believe, provides us an opportunity. We have real opportunity to reposition our brands. During this time of accelerated change, many of the transformation journeys undertaken by utilities over the last few years have been designed to solidify our operations and improve our overall customer relationships so that we might have the ability to shift our business model to meet future business challenges and needs. And that's where I think the opportunity really resides. Utilities have the potential to significantly improve brand image during this time of crisis. Expectations are high, they're always on. When there's an issue, our customers expect immediate action. Years of safe and reliable service can be forgotten in the wake of one unforeseen event or storm. The question then is, how do we best continue to position the brand during a time of challenge that is admittedly fraught with risk? Here, I think we can take a page from the book of Bezos. Everyone knows Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon. He has mastered the concept of multi-vertical branding. Whether purchasing or listening to a book, or one of a million other retail products, listening to music, watching a movie or a television show, or even operating your IT infrastructure in the cloud, Bezos and his team have positioned Amazon and the Amazon brand very purposefully. I'm not going to argue that utilities should be in the broad retail space. At least I won't argue that today. What I am arguing, though, is that utilities have inherent brand value that can be leveraged, and that we can learn how to leverage this brand value from the likes of Amazon. Amazon's clever. It understands its consumers and some basic principles regarding each of us. They work at the simplest to activate positive emotions with each of their customers. What is interesting is how they go about this and how we can leverage these same principles to the benefits of the utilities brand. One thing that we can count on being consistent is human behavior. Customer psychology will continue to be the key to driving our brand in the marketplace. A woman by the name of Erica Carranza, a PhD Vice President of Consumer Psychology at Chadwick Martin Bailey, has been quoted as saying that people are 33 times more likely to try a brand they expect to deliver strong emotional, identity, social, and functional benefits. These rules still apply. Maybe the order's changed, but the linkage remains. So what does all this have to do with Amazon and our utility brands? When I think about my personal experience with Amazon, I realize it's been carefully curated. With Amazon, I'm quickly able to achieve my goals. Sometimes even before I even realize they're my goals, I feel like I'm in control. Amazon Prime membership creates an environment where we feel we belong. We're part of a tribe. This makes us feel good about ourselves. This creates or reinforces personal identity and social belonging. We feel we can trust Amazon. We know they will deliver. We have a positive emotional experience when we engage with them. If we go to the next slide. Utilities now more than ever have the ability to further curate their customers' experience and to significantly improve and change our brand image in times of crisis. In general, our sense of control is constrained right now, even more so for our customers who are struggling financially or are concerned about similar risks. If we can use this time to proactively reach out to customers, give them information, help them formulate a plan to mitigate these risks and challenges, if we can address this stress and help the customer to avoid what would be a negative experience, we can turn the same interaction into a positive one. We can give them back control. If we can double down on our presence in the communities, we can serve in the communities where we serve our customers and let them know that we're there for them and the community. We can increase a sense of social belonging. Let them know that we're in it, not just with them, but for them. With everything else going on, our ability to keep the lights on is critical. Letting our customers know when our teams have gone in and gone above and beyond their duty to deliver. We have an opportunity to take something that's normally taken for granted and put it front and center of the customers. Customers will take away from this that they can trust the utility. They can deliver in times of need, providing that positive emotional experience. As an industry, we spent the last few years talking about customer centricity, but I would argue that we've done this without a complete grasp of what this really means. Taking a page from Amazon and Bezos, creating a positive customer experience of control, social belonging, gives us the tools and measures to become truly customer-centric. This pandemic has compressed this need, or rather created an opportunity for the utility industry to be cliche, not let a good crisis go to waste. I've always felt that this was a little bit manipulative, but when we're doing the right thing during a crisis, and those actions are based upon a long-established company and industry values, then I would say we're not taking advantage of the crisis at all, but rather stepping up to address it and fulfilling a much needed role in society, a role that utilities are actually very uniquely positioned to fulfill. If by action we improve the brand or our brand in the eyes of our customers and position our companies well for the future, then this is simply a fair and just reward. So I'm going to stop talking right now, and I'm going to hand the mic to our panelists. Michael is with us today. He's an economist. He is a teaching professor at the Department of Economics, UNC Chapel Hill. A couple questions for you. What insights do you have into economic level trends? What was happening before the crisis? How have these trends been impacted? What do you expect to see as the economy is to pull out of it? Michael?
Great. Thanks, Dave. I appreciate it. Thanks for inviting me. I love talking about the economy, so this is exciting. What I'd like to do in terms of the goal for the talk is, as Dave was saying, give you a perspective on my view for what it's worth about what's happening, also give you a framework for doing some of the analysis yourself. Next slide, please. 3 steps: before, during, after. As Dave was saying, after what, before what? COVID. So I'll spend most of our time on the after, what comes next, because obviously business is prospective, right? But we have to know where we are to chart a course to where we're going. Also, just a quick caveat, I know your purview is US and Canada. My domain of expertise is primarily the US. We know there's a close connection. I'll do my best to bridge the gap, and hopefully what I present is useful. Next slide, please. So before, I'd like you to think about 2019. All right, think about what it was like, how business was during that period of time. From a macro perspective, it was great. GDP, that's the output of the economy, was fantastic. Unemployment was low, inflation was low, cost of capital is low. That was obvious, but what wasn't so obvious is that the underpinnings, the structure of the economy, a little shaky. That wasn't quite so obvious. Also, this cycle of how great it was with GDP, it was beginning to show some signs of turning and cracking. So what I'd like to do is give you a structure and a toolbox for analyzing that. So what's the tool? What would you do? A camera. Imagine a camera, okay? Think about the lens. The aperture is how I think about the economy. So first, take a broad perspective. Long term, all right? If you think about long term, for an economist, we call that structural. You take machines, you take people, you take technology, you mix it all up, and that's the underlying potential, the structure of the economy. That's one perspective. Go back to the camera, take that lens, and you zoom in. Shorter term, as an economist, I call that cyclical, right? Structural versus cyclical. That cycle moves around the structure and it gets hit by all sorts of different shocks, the weather phenomenon, COVID, etc., and it moves around that cycle. I want you to be able to go in and out for business planning, understanding how your customers are working. Next slide, please. Thick blue line, that's the underlying structure that I was talking about, right? The potential of the economy. And it's rising, and the red line, the cycle moves along that. You see the kink in the line? Where it gets a little bit flatter, a reduced slope, that's about 10 years ago. And we had some forces in play, labor force and productivity starting to decline. And as a result, our economy was beginning to slow its underlying structure. But here's the thing, the cycle moves around up and around that with expansions and contractions. When you go to 2019, pre-COVID, okay, before COVID, we were in a precarious position because we were near that top. We had 128 quarters of beautiful economic activity, but the problem is when you're near that cyclical top and the structural decline, red to the blue, you have a long way to fall. It was a precarious position in that way. And, Dave was talking about the compressed timeline exacerbating some of the forces that were already in play. And that's what happened here. COVID generated a shock that exacerbated this potential downturn that we were already getting. Next slide, please. During what happened, we know what's going on, but what I'd like to do is give you a little historical context so you can use that for planning purposes. What I want to show you is what this recession has looked like compared to others in terms of magnitude. I'll do it for the US as well as Canada. And what I'll do is I'll benchmark it to the beginning of a typical recession. And I'll show you what a typical recession looks like, its path, declining and increasing eventually. But then I want to highlight what's been going on in this COVID recession. Next slide, please. US on the left, Canada on the right. This is what I was suggesting about the path of the economy. Okay, so the vertical axis just shows you how much the economy has grown. The technical name is GDP, but it's how big the economy is. If those lines are below that horizontal axis, that means the economy is contracting. Above, expanding. Lots of different recessions. So you could put it into historical context, but I want to call your attention to the dark blue lines. That's the Great Recession, the Great Financial Crisis, 2007, 2008. You could look side by side. You could see what happened in Canada versus the US if you want to make a cross-country comparison. Not quite as deep of a recession in Canada as it was the US, and Canada recovered more quickly than the US. Now look at the red. In both countries, it's dramatic. It's dramatic for a few reasons, okay? It's dramatic because of the magnitude. Orders of magnitude bigger than what we experienced at the depths of the Great Recession. It's dramatic because of the speed. Look at the angle on that red line, right? It's just, the rapidity is very unusual. But there's something else that's different about the red from all the others, and that's the composition. Next slide, please. There's been a very uneven impact. Again, just to make a connection, Dave was mentioning the fractured customer base. Well, we're seeing that in the macro numbers. Anything that's connected to social interaction, crumbling. Anything that doesn't require that type of social interaction got hit and is recovered or perhaps has stayed strong. Now, that's only one aspect of the economy and how you're thinking about your customer base. Obviously, the labor market, their income stream is important. So I want to put that into perspective as well. I'm going to show you the same setup of the graphs I showed you a second ago, but for the unemployment rate. Next slide, please. Be mindful of the scaling. They're not quite the same here, but nonetheless, red line is what we're going through today. Higher numbers, that's more unemployment. Dramatic, massive, whatever phrase you want to use, spike. More so in the US than in Canada, more unemployment, greater rapidity than any other recession. Now, you notice how they come down. In both of them, they've come down, which is fantastic. But even with the amount they've come down, we're still orders of magnitude higher than any past recession. Just so you can feel how big and different this one has been. It's also been different by the composition. Next slide, please. Uneven impact. Goods versus services. The goods economy, anything from work from home, computers and electronics. The labor market has held up. Green line. Red line, leisure, hospitality, services, just demolished. And we know that, we've seen that. Okay, so that's before, during. I want to spend the rest of our time together talking about after. Next slide, please. And I want you to think back with the tool that I gave you. Remember the camera? Okay, so that lens. I want you to think about that lens and go wide. All right, go wide lens, long-term structure of the economy. Remember the kink? It was flattening about 10 years ago. Well, guess what? The reason why it was flattening, labor force growth was slowing. That's still here. Another reason, productivity slowing. Still here. And it's going to be here after COVID. So the forces that were underpinning the slowdown in the structure of the economy are still going to be with us. And in fact, what's concerning is that COVID is bringing forth new forces that could fortify that or even exacerbate that slowdown. Next slide, please. the potential of the economy is built from people and machines working together with technology. Now, the graph, it's small, so don't worry about the values, but all I want you to see is that since the early 2000s, it's been on a decline. And that's because, as I mentioned, slowing labor force growth and productivity. But now you have work from home. Maybe you saw the news just recently, JP Morgan about sending people back into the office and then having to remove them. Why was that? Productivity, concerns over productivity losses. Mondays and Fridays are less productive. That could cause that blue structured line, the wide aperture, to slow. Also, less globalization, more onshoring or reshoring to bolster supply chains. You all probably know this better than I do about the Trump administration talking about electric utilities can't source, equipment from overseas. That's a friction. Now, from a macro, I know there will be micro winners, but from a macro perspective, those frictions are antithetic to growth. So that's some of the concerns I have regarding the structure going forward. Wide lens. Cyclical, thank you for forwarding this. Cyclical, I want to show you what the consensus expectation is. So this is the economic activity as measured by GDP, massive decline, and then a rebound. The consensus, for what it's worth, is that by the springtime, the pandemic is over, but we're not back to where we were. It's going to be through the fall, late 2021. Now, here's the thing. Okay, this is just a consensus, this is just a model, but it seems to be where people are rallying around. 2019, 2020, 2021, well, guess what? You know how long a typical recession lasts? About a year and a half, 2 years. So what the economists are expecting, professionals are expecting, is that the duration of this recession will be about what we typically see. We've been through recessions before. I'm sure you and your customers will be able to get through this planning wise. Now, what's different about this one, like we said, the rapidity, the speed, the magnitude, but there's something else that I wanted to bring to your attention. It's the uncertainty. Okay, now, perhaps you do this, I hope you do with the corporate finance team, et cetera. You know, when you do scenario analysis and stress testing, you take a base case, and then you say, well, what if it was a little bit better than the base case? What's our P&L? What's our customer engagement? What if it's a little bit less than that base case? What's our P&L and customer engagement? There's so much uncertainty right now. You can't do just a little above or a little bit below. You have to do a wide range. And that's what I want to call your attention to. So I want to show you some potential paths for this recovery. Next slide, please. You probably heard about all the different shapes of the newspaper, the V, the U, the W, the L, the K, the swoosh. Each of these lines are indexed to the beginning of the recession, and they show you when we might recover. Now, the green line is suggesting that we recover by the end of this year, very fast. That's a very high-end case. That purple at the bottom, this W with a big bowl at the bottom, not until 2024. That's a wide range. Prudence suggests we include a wide range in your planning for your customer perspective as well as corporate financial management. Now, the next obvious question is why there's so much uncertainty, and that revolves around the virus, one, the elections, two, also policy, fiscal and monetary policy. And I want to talk about a couple of those. And the first one I want to talk about is fiscal policy. I have to tell you, I have a little bit of a concern about policy space, the ability to act, proclivity and ability. It's almost like ammunition ready to fight another war. And do we have enough? Next slide, please. I want to show you one way to gauge that. This is debt as a percent of GDP at the federal level. Spike, World War II, economy starts to recover, debt's repaid, and then we get back. And then if it's at an average level, if there's another shock, you have room to grow and spend, etc. But it's up, it's high, it's projected to stay high. Obvious question then is, if we do have another setback, can we push higher? There's a lack of policy space, in my opinion, not just from the space above, but also proclivity from policymakers. There's also the long-term implications of this as well. So that's one. Two, I have another concern from the cyclical side. Maybe you've heard this debate already. Is what we're seeing CapEx or OpEx, capital expenditures or operating? I'm concerned what we're seeing is actually OpEx, not the organic growth that's concomitant with CapEx. Let me explain it. Next slide, if you could, please. Graph shows industrial production in the red, its growth rate over time. Really good indicator of CapEx and a little bit of OpEx mixed in there. It's hard to distinguish between the two. The blue line, don't worry about the fine little tile. I'll tell you what that means. Retention ratio. If you remember from corporate finance, you get your earnings, how much do you distribute out to shareholders, how much do you keep? That retention tells you how much you can actually use for CapEx. Usually the blue moves before the red, at a quarter to about 6 quarters. But what's unusual this time is that the red's picking up before the blue. I haven't seen that before. That's unusual. I don't quite know the reason why, but it might be a sign of what we're seeing is OpEx, not CapEx. Two concerns that I have. Next slide, please, just to summarize. So I talked about what we had before. What we're seeing now is, in my opinion, a rebound, not a recovery. Policy has been relief, not stimulus. The structural underpinning is probably being exacerbated by COVID. In my opinion, we could have a second wave of delinquencies and bankruptcies, of economic pain. And what I want to leave you with is thinking about uncertainty. And that uncertainty for the business planning begs prudence. Great. I'll stop it there and turn it over to Marissa. Thank you.
Awesome. Marissa, the perspective of the regulator.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. And Michael, thank you so much. I don't know whether to be scared or just reassured or what, but that I was following that so intently. Such fascinating data that you had to share. Thank you. I, as was introduced, lead the regulatory affairs team here at Oracle Utilities. And what I want to talk about is what we are seeing is sort of this perfect storm. And certainly we know that storms are not unique to the utility industry, not figuratively nor literally. In fact, just today here, even in the US, if you look around down where Dave is in the Southeast, we have our heroes in the industry trying to keep the lights on and get the wires back up from a hurricane that hit in the Gulf Coast. And our heroes out in the West are fighting fires and trying to keep the infrastructure from going down in these historic fires we're seeing out in the West. So, like I said, storms are not new. But the storm that we're talking about here is actually a figurative one with COVID. It came on fast and it came on furious, and certainly some of what Michael showed that. And so what we're seeing across the industry is fairly uniform, actually, in what's happening here. The utilities all of a sudden had to spend on things they hadn't spent on, and certainly it was O&M, just as Michael said. Preparing a workforce to work remotely that had never really done that before, and ensuring the safety and security of employees, and should they have to come into contact with customers. We're certainly seeing on the residential side that energy use and bills have actually gone up. People are staying home, working from home, not everybody, but many. And with the surge in unemployment, we see a real surge in arrearages and in bad debt. And then, of course, commercial and small businesses are just being really hit hard and unable to pay their bills, and this is leading to lost revenue. So indeed a perfect storm. But as we know, as a regulated industry, sometimes when determining how to address a perfect storm, sometimes the utilities have decisions made for them. And one of the earliest responses to COVID was the moratorium on service disconnects. Now, some of this was done in a mandatory way, and in many places it was certainly done voluntarily. And there, of course, have been myriad utilities stepping up to do this because it's the right thing to do. But a moratorium is not indefinite, and it truly is just a near-term solution. It's really a Band-Aid, and it is for everyone. And as you can see, some of these examples, these are coming to an end. The Band-Aid has to be taken off. and a real solution has to be determined to address this financial impact, both the customers and the utility. So just to give you a sense of what we're starting to see around the US, and I know Canada is working on this as well, many countries are, but as of the end of August, we are seeing here in the US, 33 states already have either an order in place or a staff proposal to allow for whether it's deferral of bad debt or the creation of a regulatory asset and some way to track the costs associated with COVID. But there obviously are going to remain many issues that are unresolved for quite some time on this. What's the time period of the cost recovery? What costs can actually be included in these accounts and in these trackers? What's the ability to actually recover for lost demand? And what's really the mechanism to approve this? Is it going to go in the next rate case? Is it a standalone case that's taken up with prudence and in an expedited way? So there's a lot that remains, and I'm sure many of you are feeling a lot of uncertainty right now around this, and you are not alone. And in fact, it's not necessarily going to be a smooth road. This is just one example from one state in the US, Indiana, where the utilities quite quickly on put forward a proposal for some type of approach around recovery and tracking. And you can see just in this one example that the regulators did not approve their ability to recover revenue loss. And so as we know, regulators speak with one another, they share ideas, they look at what each other is doing. And so, it's not necessarily going to be a smooth path forward or one that is necessarily quick. But what we do know is that regulators and utilities need to plan for a customer-centric approach to both bill relief and revenue collection. I mean, these are just a few examples, again, from the US, but the fast acceleration that we saw in some of the charts that Michael was showing around unemployment, and of course, now we see such a fast acceleration of an inability for customers to pay their bills. Here's an example from the state where Michael lives, North Carolina, that just in the months of April, May, and June, nearly 1.4 million residents in that state had customer accounts become eligible for disconnection. Wisconsin is seeing a third of customers behind on their bill payments compared to 12% the prior year, so almost a tripling of that. And Indiana, again, just seeing a tremendous number of customers who are multiple months behind on their bill. So the takeaway, and I think what you'll find exciting next when Matt tees up some really interesting data analytics and research that have been conducted within Oracle Utilities, is that customers need options and they want control to manage their energy costs and their bills. So let me stop here and I'll turn it over to Matt and he'll share some of that insight with you.
Great. Thanks, Marissa. Can folks hear me on the line? I'm going to assume yes. I got a yes in the chat. Okay, that's great. My name is Matt Frates. I'm going to present some customer research findings related to the impact of COVID on utility end customers. I lead the UGBU analytics team, and our mission is to use data to improve, to measure the impact of the OPower solutions on end customers and to improve that impact over time in a data-driven way. And so as soon as COVID hit, and recognizing the role that Oracle plays and Oracle Solutions play in helping utilities serve their customers, we immediately dove in on a bunch of research projects to understand the impact of COVID-19 and the response to COVID-19 on utility customers, with the eye toward anticipating what's coming down the road and helping to adapt our solutions to help meet customer needs. Next slide. So I'm going to cover sort of three pillars of findings from our research in a very short period of time, in a whirlwind, but I think it's all relevant here. The first one is that we can see that residential customer usage patterns are shifting, and that COVID-19 has changed how residential customers use energy, when they use it during the day, and their bills. Go to the next slide. So first we can look at using AMI data We can look at a average usage profile at scores of utilities for whom we have data and work with. And so here on the y-axis, it's how much energy within a given hour is the average customer using, and on the x-axis, it's the 24 hours of the day in June in 2020 on weekdays. And so the blue line here, the one on the bottom largely, is last year's June usage profile for these customers, June 2019. The dotted red line is what we would expect usage to be this year based on weather and the historical relationship between weather and how much energy folks use. And the solid red line on the top mostly here is the usage that we observed in June 2020 at this utility. And so when we compare the dotted red line to the solid red line, we can make some observations about what we can interpret as the effect of COVID on the shape and amount of customer usage. And so the first thing you can see just moving left to right here is in the morning hours, 6, 7, 8 in the morning, we see at this utility and across many that the dotted line is above the solid red line. And that means that we expected they'd use more energy at that time of day than they are using, and that's people rising later. As you proceed throughout the day, pretty much for the rest of the day, more energy is being used, and that's because folks are home during the day when they otherwise weren't, and they're home during the evening when they otherwise weren't, and they're cooking food at home when sometimes they might purchase it out of the home. And oh, by the way, it was a hot summer, so we even expected usage to be higher, and yet instead this peak on average is considerably higher than even we would have expected given record temperatures, and more on that later. On the next slide, you can see using our deep learning models that take an AMI signal and use artificial intelligence to disaggregate that usage signal into its component parts of appliance categories. We can understand not just how through the AMI data directly usage is changing, but why it's changing and which particular appliance behaviors are driving that change. So just a couple stories here to demonstrate that research. This graph here shows in blue the usage of hot water heaters before COVID. In orange, we see it during and after the COVID response. And so we can see that the hot water usage peak in the morning is later than it was. Of course, that's the later shower and the tank filling up after the shower, folks getting up later. On the next slide, another little story here. The laundry is happening during the week in a way that it didn't used to be. So folks are using their washer and dryer during the day. And overall, actually, incidentally, basically doing less laundry, although you can't see it in this view. But if you Google the sweatpants effect, you'll find a fun blog on how people are wearing sweatpants. And I'm not even on video right now, so I won't make any comment on the type of pants I'm wearing. But in general, sweatpants are being worn and less laundry is being done. Next slide. So if we think about, you can think about there being two effects of changes in energy patterns that we've seen, energy usage patterns. One would be on the bill and the other would be on the grid. First, let's talk about the bill. So here, this plot shows the ratio of bills in a given year to the previous year. So for this utility, in a sort of March, April kind of bill in 2018, how much was that bill compared to last year? And it's a frequency plot. So the peak of this thing is basically at 1. Most of the bills were similar to in 2018 as they were in 2017, some more, some less. Next slide. In the following year in 2019, same March, April bill window, again, centered around 1, where the most frequent thing is you have a similar bill than last year and nice bell curve around 1, some more, some less. If you look at 2020, at this utility, not the same. So here, we just see that distribution moving over to the right, widening and stretching more toward much greater ratios. So here, like 1.5% would be 150% bill as a percentage of last year, or 50% greater. So you go to the next slide, you just, how do we like grok that? We can see here, let's just arbitrarily put a threshold and say, what percentage of customers in a given year experience a bill in April that's 50% higher than it was the previous year? And so in the 2018 and 2019, that percent was 8% for residential and customers at this utility. In 2020, it was 35%, well, obviously way more. And on the next slide, we can do segments on that metric and see, which types of customers is it impacting. a critical one here to look at is low-income customers versus not low-income customers, vulnerable customers versus less vulnerable customers. And we see that both of those customer segments are experiencing this increase in bills, and that is a concern. And on the next slide, we think about providing experiences to those customers that are responsive to their needs and recognizing what may be bill shock for some customers, where bill shock is viewed as having a large bill increase and being exposed to great vulnerability to such an increase in their bills. You can see that upper right quadrant is a segment of customers who is vulnerable and experiences that high bill. These are customers at risk of falling into arrearages, degrading relationship with their utility, and who need help. And so, our solutions are designed to identify these customers, and we're working hard to develop new indices to identify and anticipate the customers who are vulnerable and provide them with the experiences and information that they need to reduce their risk and improve their lives. Next slide. The next pillar 2 of 3 here is customers are in fact seeking control of their energy affordability and their costs. So next slide. We fielded a bunch of customer surveys during COVID. We do all the time, but special surveys to understand how customers are experiencing this rather unprecedented time. And so I'm going to run through some high-level findings on the survey research. So one question is, we just asked customers, how has your home energy use changed during COVID? And customers believe, a plurality, majority of customers believe that their energy use has increased. Now, I already showed you customers' energy use has increased. We have the meter data to show that directly, but here, this is important. I'm not trying to prove that the usage has changed. I'm trying to prove that customers are aware of and they believe that their home energy use has increased. And it's the customer mindset we're diving into here. So the awareness is there, the salience is there. Customers believe their usage has increased. On the next slide. We also ask customers if they've experienced any loss of or reduction in employment, and additionally ask them if they're concerned about being able to afford their energy bills. Then you can slice the answer to the latter by the former. First of all, about almost half of customers have reported that someone in their household has experienced a loss or reduction of employment. And so among those even who have not experienced such a loss of employment, almost 40%, over 40% of those customers experience either moderate or extreme, or are reporting experiencing either moderate or extreme anxiety about affording their bills. But if you cut it by those customers who have experienced a loss of or reduction of employment, you see a rather dramatic increase to like 65% total, and a doubling of those customers reporting a 9 or 10 extreme anxiety about affording the upcoming bill. Next slide. We know that customers are, this is motivating customers to reduce their home energy use. So in general, we ask them, are you motivated? And customers in general are motivated to reduce their home energy use. And we've fielded that question in the past. That's a consistent response. But on the right, we also ask, what is COVID-19 doing to your motivation? Is it increasing or decreasing? And over half of customers saying that COVID-19 is making customers more motivated to reduce their home energy use. Next slide. This is a really simple chart, but it kind of blew me away when we found this. We asked customers, how control at this time do you feel in the following expense categories in your household budget? And so restaurants, in-home entertainment, groceries, customers in general feel in control of those spending categories. And I would say that's fairly accurate. Transportation, water, internet, electricity and gas, and housing. Electricity and gas and housing at the bottom tied for I have the least amount of control over this category. Now, housing, I think that it makes sense to me. It's pretty sticky, your housing situation. You don't want to have to move. You can't easily negotiate your rent or your mortgage payment. But electricity and gas, that is not accurate, I would say, objectively. Customers do have control over their energy use, and yet, descriptively, when you ask them, do you feel in control, they report that they feel equally in control of that as with housing, which is a perception problem. Next slide. And so the final pillar of 3 here is that there is an opportunity for utilities to help customers, otherwise known as people, with this problem. Next slide. So we asked customers in these surveys, how interested are you in receiving the following types of information from your utility at this time? And we're ranking these in descending order here, where customers were most interested in, and over 3/4 of customers interested in things like tips on how to save energy in your home, information about overall home energy usage, notifications you're on track for a higher than normal bill, promotions for home energy saving programs, information about hourly home energy usage. Next slide. We also asked utilities, what percentage, how do you receive this? What types of information have you actually received? And so this is the same order from the previous slide, but the responses are a little different in the percentage of customers who actually receive these. And on the next slide, we'll just superimpose the "Are you interested?" white bar together with the "Have you received it yet?" red bar. And so you can see these are almost like progress bars. You can imagine it's loading up, where if you fill the whole white bar up, then everybody who wanted something got it. But if you don't, you're at the beginning of your progress bar and you're going to have to wait. So in the next slide, you can just see where are the biggest gaps of unmet demand for certain types of communication. And I've highlighted a few somewhat arbitrarily, but these are the biggest ones. Biggest gap, notifications you're on track for a higher than normal bill. Customers want that proactive notification. And maybe tied for third is tips, promotions for home energy savings, and information about hourly usage. Next slide. So really briefly touching on this, the grid size, we talk a little bit, or quite a bit extensively, about the customer experience, and I think that's right for this presentation, but there is a grid side to this too, where if we just observe that it has been an incredibly hot summer in North America and across the globe, that heat has increased usage, and particularly during peak periods and on peak demand days. In the summer, we observed that in the data. We observed it with these dotted lines, and that our analysis also shows that COVID and having customers stay at home has exacerbated those peaks. It has increased usage during the peaks, even above the record high levels of usage that we would see given the very high temperatures. And this is a problem. Now, many are likely familiar that overall demand in many service territories is down because of the balance of commercial and industrial decreases that nets out the residential increases. But really, this grid management problem is one of managing distribution and distribution capacity. And we've seen some distribution capacity shortfalls already, resulting in disruptions in service from patterns like this. And so very briefly here, a couple more slides. On the next slide, we can just show some of the programs that we field that meet the types of customer need that I described earlier. The customers say, I would like to have tips for how to save energy. I'd like to understand how I'm using energy and how I can connect with ways to save installation measures or changes in my own behavior to save energy and save costs. We field those programs as randomized controlled trials in the same way as a drug trial, and we can directly measure the impact of those programs on energy use behaviors, customer satisfaction, and other outcomes. So very, very, very briefly on that topic, we can just see that in June 2020 at this Eastern Electric utility, we have one of these programs in the field, and you can see that it dramatically reduces energy usage. So it actually does change customer behavior. It does result in savings, and it does help to manage the grid at that time. And it did critically help during the COVID period, which was honestly a question that my team did not know the answer to until we actually measured it during this unprecedented time. And we can verify that these programs in the field are in fact influencing customer behaviors and helping them to save, and that those savings are in fact focused on the demand peak period when it is most useful to the grid and where it actually may cause customers to save even more in areas where there are time of use rates or demand charges. So that's a lot, and I'm happy to answer some Q&A, but next slide, I can pass the mic to Dave. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. I appreciate it. Honestly, Mike, Marissa, Matt, each of you taught me something today. I mean that with utmost sincerity. It has been intriguing. Some of it has been a little bit scary. Some of it has been encouraging. And I am, I think, excited about where we can take things. I think it's given us a significant signal that we do have to lean in. Given the industry role in society, I feel like we need to continue to look for new and better ways to engage with and communicate with our customers. as we all go through this together. Next slide. One thing that we've found with the communications that we've been sending out, has been working with our customers, is that across the board, customers are clearly more engaged. The open rates that we're seeing in communications have gone up across the board, whether it's high bill alerts, usage reports, energy reports. Customers are engaging more with communications. We're seeing increases of 8% on the high bill alerts, 2% on the usage reports, 4% on the energy reports. And this represents a significant opportunity to communicate with and influence the customers. But here's what's amazing. The completion rates on home energy audits. Now, this is a product where customers are able to go in and do a self-audit against their domicile, their home, their apartment, et cetera. And we've seen a significant increase in completion rates, over 670% in just one day alone. And I think this points to customers having financial concerns, and they're looking for ways to save and control some of that discretionary spend that Matt was talking about. If we go to the next slide, the question then really is what is working? When COVID hit, we went back and redesigned and worked through a number of our different messages that we are helping our utility customers to reach out to their customers with. And the one thing we did was we realized that within a certain area, a region, the service territory of a utility, we've actually got a pretty high penetration rate for the ability to talk to households, talk to homeowners. Created some messaging around COVID, that is a sort of place to go for our customers to find out more, link them out to various government agencies and what have you. And what was amazing was the percentage of clicks that we saw there. 90% of the clicks that were there were related to this COVID module that we built out in response to the pandemic that had struck. And what that told us is that utility, as I mentioned, has the ability to talk to large swaths of the population, and those communications don't necessarily just need to be about the interaction on the energy front. Broader responsibility, broader opportunity to affect messages associated with social good. The other area that we saw significant click-through on was around places where customers can save. So you saw on the previous slide the 670% increase around the home energy audits, and now seeing a significant click-through rate on ways that people can help save energy. So we can work with them to help them monitor their discretionary spend, their discretionary energy usage, help them gain control, right? Which I think is critical at this time. We've seen a number of different sort of strategies to messaging in the marketplace. A lot of them have been successful, and we've leaned in on the messaging infrastructure that we've had in place ahead of the pandemic and leverage that to help our customers help their customers going forward. So with that, I think we've gotten to the end of the formal part of our presentation. We do have the opportunity for Q&A.
Thanks, David. So thank you for those excellent insights and information. I think it's really going to help our members to plan the path forward. So I thank all of you. So we had somebody ask if you can share which Canadian utilities have implemented the home energy reports. I don't know if that's possible or not.
I think if we could follow up with that, I'm not sure which we're able to disclose or not disclose that are using the home energy reports. Okay. But we could follow up. We could follow up with an answer there.
Yeah. Okay. It's across several provinces. We can follow up.
Okay.
In the spirit of that question, and we will follow up on the answer to it, I think there's also a broader formulation of the question, which is, I just wanted to be clear, even though the O-Power solutions are very well known for the home energy report flagship product, there are many other experiences that are super relevant to provide customers, including High Bill Alert, which was mentioned, and others, that it may be valuable for us to share some of the Canadian experience with as well.
Okay, great. Thank you, Matt. So people, feel free to use the chat function and ask any questions that you may have. We still have 5 minutes left over. In the meantime, I'm wondering, Matt, in your customer research, did the customers who reported feeling bill anxiety look any different in the types of information they're seeking from their utilities?
That's a good question. Thank you for that one. Yes, I mentioned we did ask, do you feel bill anxiety? In some of the same surveys, we asked those questions around what communications you're interested in seeing. We performed those cuts on the data. The same patterns generally are true in terms of what customers are interested in, but the more anxiety a customer is feeling about their bills, the more they're reported seeking information. And so instead of seeing something like 3/4 of customers wanting tips, it's like 90% of customers wanting tips. Instead of seeing like 70% of customers wanting a high bill alert, it's actually 90% on that one too, among the customers feeling a lot of bill anxiety. And so the gaps that then emerge from the customers who've received them are much larger. They're to the tune of like 60 to 70% gaps of customers who say they want something and they're not getting it, and the bill alerts themselves rising to the number 2 priority level for customers experiencing extreme bill anxiety. And the only other thing I'd mention in terms of the difference that among the customers who are experiencing anxiety about their bills is those options sort of in the bottom of the ranking for the general population of survey respondents that include things like, I'd like to have information about payment options or billing assistance help. Those are also at the 90% level among the bill anxiety people, as you might expect them to be, and the gap there is something on the order of 40% of customers want it but aren't getting it. And so while among the general population, customers are generally well connected with the options they have for billing assistance programs, among those customers feeling the greatest anxiety, they do not feel they have access to that information at this time.
Okay, thank you very much. And then one other question, the vulnerable low-income customers tend to be those that are harder to reach. Can you describe how effective your engagement solutions are for these customers?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's tons of metrics that you could use to evaluate how effective communications are. I'll just touch on a couple. We do, as I mentioned, field a lot of our experiences as randomized control trials to be able to measure with accuracy and precision their effect on different sorts of metrics like energy behaviors, customer sat, program awareness, calling behavior, many different metrics. Just an example, the aforementioned home energy reports, we field those to all kinds of customers, including low-income customers. And when we look at low-income customers, we've actually seen that those customers read the reports even more than the general population. They see a bigger bump in satisfaction with the report, with their utilities as a result of them, and they see a bigger jump in awareness of utility programs than the general population does. And that's driven actually by both the readership and also a very low, relatively low baseline of awareness. And so I think the part of the question premise, which is, these customers are hard to reach, I think that's true. But when you do successfully reach them, you see a greater percentage increase in impact on customer value and customer happiness metrics, awareness metrics, because the baseline is low. And so in short, these communications do reach the customers, and they do impact those customers, and in many cases, even more successfully than the average customer.
Great, thank you, good to know. So on that note, I just wanted to thank all of our panelists and our members one more time for joining us. Really appreciate your time today. That was really, really excellent. And any additional questions, members, please feel free to send them along, and we can follow up after the webinar. So finally, all of our future events and webinars can be found in our monthly newsletter, The Current Affairs, or you can go to News and Events section on our website, electricity.ca. So thanks, everybody. Have a great day.